Diagwith, boys and girls, it's time once again for the video game series that will probably never end, Japan Only PS1 Games, Volume 8. As always, we're going to pluck 3 Japanese exclusive PS1 games from the wheel at random, and check out one bonus game chosen by you, the lovely viewer. I hope you're ready for some prime Japanese video game goodness, because the wheel is primed and ready, and you better believe it will provide.
The wheel will provide.
Volume 8's first game is Project Gaiaray, which made its way to the PlayStation in October of 1997. It was both published and developed by the team at Shueisha. Shueisha?
Shueisha. Shushashi. Shushu. Boy.
Well, whoever they are, they're mostly known for making mech games, and unsurprisingly, Project Gaiaray is a mech game. Now I can already hear some of you out there. Sean, is this a Virtualon clone? And the answer to that is yes, unashamedly so. For those unaware, Virtualon is a long-running robot combat series from Sega, well known for utilising a twin-stick control setup. It started out in the arcades and seen ports to everything from the Saturn to the Dreamcast, and even its most recent entry on the PS4 and Vita that only came out in 2018, so I guess Virtualon is still alive and kicking, even though it is arguably one of Sega's most forgotten franchises, especially outside of Japan. Well, Project Gaiaray over here is more or less an attempt to bring Virtualon over to the PlayStation, and you know what? Ain't nothing wrong with that. The twin-stick robot combat genre ain't exactly swimming with entries, so frankly, the more of these we have, the better. But that begs the question, is Project Gaiaray actually any good? Well, let's find out. Now, seeing as this is technically a fighting game, Project Gaiaray features your standard list of modes. We got versus against the CPU or human, and there's also the game's arcade mode, which here goes for the notably more aggressive name of attack mode. This is where you'll spend most of your time in game as you fight through a series of arena battles, all while dashing about as a cool robot with a big sword. Sometimes even 2 swords. It's pretty great. When you start the game, you'll have access to a roster of 6 playable robots, each with their own unique set of weaponry. Each robot has 3 different attacks, a left and right range weapon using the square and triangle buttons, and a close range attack using a melee weapon, which becomes available once you get close enough to an enemy robot. This setup will be very familiar to those who have played the OG Virtualon, and look, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. The battles themselves are straightforward 1v1 affairs. Hit your opponent with attacks, take its life bar down to empty, bam, you win a round. The part that makes these games interesting, however, is the speed at which these robots move and the way that you have to dash and scale inside these arenas, taking advantage of your positioning to outsmart your opponent, making for these really intense and high-octane duels. Or you could just dash in and go to town with a sword, you know, whatever works for you. Of course, for a game like this, you'd want to have some responsive movement and camera controls. Now, before we talk about the controls, you have to keep in mind this genre of video game was generally built around the use of this twin-stick style controller, and you can guarantee any console that has a Virtualon game probably has one of these controllers too. And would you believe it, Project Gaiaray over here also supports such a controller, the original PS1 analog joypad, the one that was released in 1996 and never made it out of Japan. Seriously though, it supports like 50 games. You could be playing Treasures of the Deep with this controller right now. But let's say you're like me, and I'm going to assume most people who have and will play this game in that we don't have a dual stick analog pad lying around. So how does the gameplay adapt over to a regular PS1 joypad? Turns out quite well actually. So first things first, you do have a few different view options when playing this game, but I'm going to say every option bar the default setting is way too close for comfort. Your robot's directional movement is controlled using the D-pad as you'd expect, and each robot also has the ability to jump and dash in any direction. Jumping and dashing are huge parts of this game as they are the main way to keep on top of your enemies and also evade their attacks. You can dash in any direction you like as long as you're on the ground, and you can even tap the button again mid-dash to perform a dash cancel, which is not only great for faking out enemies, but it makes a really cool noise whenever you do it. There's also a way to cancel out jumps, but it is nowhere near as useful, nor does it have a cool sound effect, so let's just pay it no mind. Now you might be wondering where camera control comes into play, and funnily enough, there aren't any. Kinda. You see, this game revolves around using a lock-on system to track your enemies. Once an enemy is in your view, all of your attacks will fire at that enemy. Once they leave your view, you'll then lose your lock on them. Now, since you can't move the camera to reface them, what can you do? Well, you can turn your robot using the L1 and R1 buttons, but only when standing still, which you never really want to do. Instead, the much better option is to either perform a jump or dash cancel, either of which will automatically recenter your view on the enemy. It sounds kinda odd on paper, but it's surprising how well this works. You have the ability to move quickly around the map, dash out of some enemy fire, cancel mid-dash to lock onto the enemy, and then unleash a barrage of fire to blow them up. And when the enemy is also trying to do this to you, well, then it becomes good chaotic fun. Your dashes and jumps even augment your attacks, so if you fire while doing either, you'll unleash an even more powerful attack, with the added side effect of being left vulnerable just afterwards. And of course, to add even more flair, finally a feature that has not been lifted from the original Virtualon: special attacks. If you press both of your turn buttons together at the same time, you can charge up your robot. Once your meter is full, you can then unleash one of two different special attacks by pressing both attack buttons together: a long-range attack on the ground and a melee attack if used from a jump. These attacks can quickly turn the tide of a battle, and they also look pretty spectacular and sometimes pretty janky, but damn are they effective. Now, I'm not exactly very experienced in this genre of games outside of dabbling with a little Virtualon on both my Dreamcast and Saturn, but this is the first time I ever really stuck with and tried to learn one of these arena fighting games, and I don't know, I think this game right here is actually really good. It's really fast paced, controls surprisingly well all things considered, and actually allows for some nice strategic and skill based gameplay in spite of your robot's relatively simple moveset. I was finding this game kind of easy at first honestly, but bumping the game up to hard difficulty really highlights the game at its best when it forces you into making quick decisions under pressure and utilizing all of your robot's movement abilities to land one or two significant hits on your opponent. It's just really fun. Of course, I imagine this game is by far at its best with 2 players, which I sadly didn't get to try, but the hard AI should entertain you for a little while anyway. Although, judging by the game only having 6 characters, that might not be for too long. Fear not though, because the game does feature unlockable content in the form of 3 new fighters and a new arena for each. Very nice. They are thankfully pretty easy to get. You more or less just have to beat attack mode once with each character, and if you want to speedrun it like me, you can set the fights to 1 round if you like, and you'll have them all in no time. Thankfully, once you're done with attack mode, you can then take on the newly unlocked survival mode, which tasks you with beating every robot in the game on a single health bar. That of course regenerates a little bit of health after each fight, as is tradition. Beating this mode then unlocks more cool features, most importantly of which is the return of the robot model viewer, and the other 2 unlocks I'll leave as a surprise. Gotta keep something to the imagination, you know? I suppose since we're on the model viewer, we might as well talk about the presentation, and while the robots certainly take a lot of influence from a certain game I've mentioned too many times in this video, I still think they look quite nice. Not as detailed or as exciting as some other robot games, but on the whole, I quite like the designs. The game definitely highlights them best at the beginning of attack mode with some really nice lighting effects, and of course the boss robots, they get some pretty nice intros too, that are also sometimes spooky. Once you're in-game, the arenas and environments are... they're fine. There's some definite standouts and nice variety from location to location, but generally they're rather basic and serve as nothing more than a slight change in geometry for your robots to work with, although I do always appreciate a nice low-res city at night background, a mid-90s fighting game staple. You love to see it. Performance here is pretty good too. It's not quite the locked 30 FPS you'll see in the Saturn port of Virtual On, but Project Gaiaray does manage to hit a stable 30 FPS the majority of the time, but you will definitely see the odd noticeable drop to the mid-20s on occasion, which is usually dependent on the amount of crap exploding on screen. I thought the game ran pretty well by my standards, but I'm sure Virtual On diehards might find the odd bit of stuttering a turn off. At least the game has a great soundtrack, right? Right? Yeah, it's pretty amazing. Whether it's the wacky opening theme or the many synth-heavy battle themes, Project Gaiaray has a great up-tempo soundtrack, really well suited to the fast-paced gameplay. Definitely one to check out.
Action! Results will be handled in the upper hand. You win. All of the tasks have been completed. Good job.
Also, this is kind of off topic, but does anybody out there know the wrestler Shinsuke Nakamura? You might know him from his time in New Japan Pro Wrestling or more recently over in the WWE. Well, Shinsuke Nakamura's New Japan entrance theme is actually inspired by a track from this game. Look, hear for yourself. It's the exact same, right? I thought I was going mad, but supposedly the composer of Nakamura's theme confirmed it, so there you go, there's a weird little fact for you. Alright, yeah, the game. Project Gaiaray. Really like this one. It's not the most technically complex fighting game, it's only got a few hours of content, and it's certainly not the most inspired idea on the console, but I'd be lying if I said the gameplay didn't hit the mark for me. The controls are really good, the action is fast and explosive, and the AI will keep you on your toes without ever feeling unbalanced. It's just a cool robot fighting game, maybe not as good as the one from Sega, but for a PS1 clone it is a damn good one in its own right. Also, the soundtrack is class, it's very import friendly, and it supports a really weird controller, so if you like Virtual On, fighting games, or robots with big swords, this one should definitely be worth a look.
Action!
The wheel will provide.
Next up we have Psychometrer Eiji, a name that I definitely don't have a hard time saying. This game made its way to the PlayStation in February of the year 1999 and is based on the popular manga series of the same name, which first launched in '96. It tells the age-old story of a high school delinquent named Eiji who discovers he has psychometry, an ability that allows him to touch inanimate objects and see visions of the past. Naturally, an ability like that is useful to the police, so the story involves Eiji teaming up with a detective to solve murders. Notably, in spite of the manga's popularity, the series has yet to see an anime adaptation, but it does have a live-action television drama that launched in 1997. I'll be honest, I know very little about the manga or this TV drama show, but would you believe the soundtrack to this TV series was composed by Soichi Terada, the genius behind the amazing Ape Escape soundtrack. Seriously, put some monkeys in this scene and you couldn't tell the difference. Anyway, that brings us to the PS1 game, Psychometrer Eiji, and I'm gonna be upfront with you on this one, guys. I might have messed up with this selection. You know the way all I have to go off when choosing games for this series are the 10 seconds of footage shown during the VGL videos? Well, the 10 seconds I saw look like this. Whereas 90% of the game actually looks like this. Yeah, so I might have taken on an adventure game full of Japanese dialogue and text that also happens to feature a very small amount of beat 'em up sections. Now, I didn't know this when I started playing the game, but I did catch on to it pretty quickly, and by quickly I mean about an hour into the game, 1 minute of which was beating up dudes. Now, in spite of all this, I was at least curious to see how far I could get into it, since I could maybe show off any of the cool stuff I find and possibly even try to piece together what was going on. And from what I gather, we're trying to solve the murder of a police detective who got stabbed by a perp who was found on the scene and had also died at the same time, seemingly of a drug overdose. You might wonder how I was able to piece this all together, but we'll get into that in a moment. The game sees you swapping around to different characters from time to time, with the main two being Eiji and his detective partner Ryoko. Some scenes might just be all dialogue, with the odd multiple choice question popping up from time to time, and others might see you wandering around environments with static backgrounds, searching for items or clues. The game mostly follows the generic adventure game formula through the lens of a murder mystery, like a weird episode of CSI, but you've also got a psychic high schooler with you. The game does seem relatively simple, definitely designed with console gameplay in mind. No super complicated inventory or clicking puzzles. It's mostly just a case of talking to everybody, visiting everywhere, and eventually you'll probably find out what you need to do. Now, I could make it through the game without any hassle for a while, but eventually I did make it to my first roadblock within the police station. You see, this is a pretty large area with a lot of things to interact with. Now, as far as I know, there are no written guides for this game online, although there is a long play from a Japanese account, which I will link in the description, so help is out there if you need it. Although a while back I remember somebody asking me why don't I try using Google Lens when playing through a Japanese game, and I figured, well, what better time than now to try it out, and would you believe it, Google Lens was able to translate pretty much everything that popped up on screen through my phone's camera. It was certainly not an enjoyable way to play, nor was it the most accurate translation, but I could effectively play the whole game by doing this, if I wanted to. You see, anytime something important or useful pops up in this game, the text will appear in green. It might tell you who to talk to or where to go to next. So what I did is I skipped pretty much all the normal text and just translated this stuff, and there you go, you're able to play a text-based game, no problem. Now, would I ever recommend playing a game like this? No way, it is a pain to stop and translate each individual screen, but if you had no other way to do it and really wanted to play a game like this, it's definitely doable. Although I will 100% be using this method with menus and options in other Japanese games going forward, so I highly recommend trying out Google Lens on some of these games if you're ever stuck yourself. Of course, to the surprise of nobody, playing an adventure game without being able to pick up on the dialogue and story is not a very fun time. Doing it this way results in a game that is mostly just a series of fetch quests and skipping text. Of course, we have to talk about these beat 'em up sections, the reason I'm playing the game, and let me tell you, This is the most basic 3D brawler you could imagine. You've got one attack button, one simple combo, and a dash attack. In all honesty, it doesn't play that bad, but it very much feels like a brawler minigame that has been added to a dialogue-heavy adventure game. It's a fun little addition to have, but for how simple it is, how quickly they pass by, and how little they show up throughout the game, they are 100% not worth playing this game for, even though it is kinda cool that there's an adventure game with brawler segments, you know? As for the presentation, I think this is where the game shines the brightest. Obviously, I can't tell what's going on here, but the game does feature a whole heap of voice dialogue and even plenty of animated cutscenes with some really high production values. The game is pretty much the closest thing you can currently get to an animated version of the series, and there's about 20 minutes of FMV here altogether, so it's definitely a treat for fans on that front. Most of the time though, you will be looking at 3D models while you chat away. Now the models here also look pretty good, aiming for a nice animated, almost cel-shaded style. I wouldn't say it's the most polished example of this style that I've seen on the console. They can sometimes look a little goofy and there's lots of wacky PS1 shimmer going on, but I think on the whole they did a good job of translating the manga style over to the console. The backgrounds and environments are decent too. There's some nice use of color in the backgrounds while you chat, and the static environments look pretty nice as well. The environments are nothing spectacular since they mostly take place in everyday locations like the streets, police station, and shopping malls, but they do the job just fine and are easy to read and navigate. The battles, on the other hand, they can certainly look pretty janky, but as I said before, they at least play competently enough, so you can't really complain too much. On the sound front, we already mentioned that the game is full of voice dialogue, which sounds very professional to my ears, but I'm definitely the wrong guy to ask. But knowing that Soichi Terada made the music for the TV drama had me very excited to see what this PS1 title brought to the table, and unfortunately, I left feeling a little underwhelmed. It's not bad by any means, it's a pleasant but mostly forgettable soundtrack that I think suits the game well. But it didn't really have any tracks that stood out as something worth listening to outside of the game, except maybe the intro theme, which is pretty great. Now for a time I thought I might actually just finish this whole game just to see what the experience would be like, but after 2 hours of fetch quest, dialogue, and maybe 3 fights totaling roughly 2 to 3 minutes of gameplay, I knew I was really just wasting my time. So yeah, safe to say this is a very import unfriendly title, but hey, it's not the game's fault I got fooled by the beat 'em up sections. Clearly I'm in no position to be a fair judge of this game's quality, seeing as the story and dialogue is so integral to enjoying this type of experience, but to its credit, Psychometrer Eiji is an interesting adventure game title on the console, with solid fundamentals, some lovely FMV, decent visuals, and some really janky fighting sections, but hey, I guess that makes it kinda special. If you like the series and can speak and read Japanese, well maybe give this one a try, and if you can't, well at least give the soundtrack to the TV drama a listen. Now that's something everybody could appreciate.
The wheel will provide.
Now it's time for the Japanese game with a very French name. It's Robbit Mon Dieu, coming to the PlayStation in October of 1999. Now I'm going to assume most of you are at least a little bit familiar with the Jumping Flash series, technically the first 3D mascot platformer to ever release on the PlayStation, and according to the Guinness Book of World Records was the first fully 3D platform game ever. Although, unlike any other mascot platformer before or since, unusually the series takes place from a first-person perspective, with you controlling this adorable robot rabbit, conveniently named Robbit. I'll be honest with you, I adore this series. Both Jumping Flash games are very short and also quite easy, but they are endlessly charming and very near and dear to my heart. Also, considering it's a first-person game, the platforming is way better than it probably has any right to be. Somehow these guys managed to make platforming work in first person, all while people were still figuring out how to do it in third person. And even more impressively, Jumping Flash wasn't even the first time they did this. The developer behind the series was a team called Exact, and if that name seems familiar and you don't know Jumping Flash, it's also because they made Ghost in the Shell. But before all that PS1 stuff, they actually made games for the Sharp X68000 over in Japan. And this little game right here, called Geograph Seal, is their first attempt at a first-person 3D title featuring gameplay that's almost one-to-one with Jumping Flash, but a whole year before it. Now you might think that this game right here is actually the first 3D platformer, but Geograph Seal is almost entirely focused on action compared to Jumping Flash, which is more of a platformer with a little bit of gunplay added in. Also a little off topic, but if you've never listened to music from the Sharp X68000, the computer has some incredible stuff. It uses a Yamaha FM synth chip that's very similar to the Mega Drive sound chip, but with a few more channels, and it can produce some amazing stuff. Geograph Seal being one such example. Anyway, I should probably start talking about our next game, so here's Robbit Mon Dieu, the third game in the Jumping Flash series, which, as you somehow might have guessed, never made it out of Japan. Also, in case you're wondering, Robbit Mon Dieu translates to Robbit My God. Definitely rolls off the tongue better in French, I think. Now, unlike the previous games in the series, this one wasn't developed by Exact, and that's because Exact got absorbed into a new studio called Sugar and Rockets, who are now developing this game, so it's at least as close to Exact as you can possibly get. Now, I've wanted to try this game for some time. I'm well aware Jumping Flash wasn't too popular in the West, but I was still curious to find out why it never came out over here, why it wasn't called Jumping Flash 3, and more importantly, is it actually any good? Well, I'm glad to say we're going to answer all those questions today. So first things first, is this actually Jumping Flash 3? Well, I guess you could argue that it is, but I'm going to say no. Yes, this game plays almost exactly like other Jumping Flash titles, but there's enough changes here to make it feel like its own separate thing, most notably with its structure and plot. You see, the previous two Jumping Flash games were linear platformers where you played through levels one by one until you fight a boss, beat him, and then move on to the next world to do it all over again until you eventually save the world. In Robbit Mon Dieu, well, there's no world to save. Everything is actually a-okay thanks to your efforts in the last game. You see, the main character, Robbit, is an unarmed robot sent out by a government agency called the Universal City Hall, or UCH for short. And when these robots aren't out saving the world, their normal role is actually just to assist citizens with everyday tasks, be it helping lost children get home, protecting farmers' produce from hungry moles, or even stopping planes from crashing into the ocean. Let's just say they're pretty versatile machines. So rather than follow the linear format of the last two games, this one instead features a collection of different missions where you help the citizens of the planet Hanamura with whatever request they may need. And unlike the previous games, which had very little in the way of story and plot, this game features a ton of plot with voice dialogue, cutscenes, letters, newspapers. There is a lot.
So to answer the question, why didn't this game come out in the West?
Well, the translation effort would have been huge, and considering the series' poor sales in the West up until this point, well, let's just say things are starting to add up. So here we are once again with another game that features a lot of text, voice and story, all in Japanese, and while I couldn't really enjoy or appreciate this aspect of the game, the fact it's aimed at a younger audience does make a lot of it quite easy to follow, and more importantly, the game part isn't really stuck behind the language barrier. You see, all your missions are selected from this world map. You simply just have to move around it to a point that has a help sign, press a couple of buttons, and there you go, you're into the mission. Each of these missions do begin with an objective in Japanese. Now, if you like, you can use Google Lens to quickly tell you what you need to do, but personally, I didn't come across a single mission where the goal didn't seem immediately obvious, outside of one mission where I had to stop a plane from crashing, but that wasn't so much down to the language barrier, more the fact that shooting the plane seemed to heal it for some reason. Usually that has the opposite effect, you know? Now, mission types can vary from simply getting from point A to point B, destroying a certain number of enemies around the map, hunting down a number of objects, platforming challenges, ring challenges, time challenges, the odd boss battle, and even some throwbacks to classic jumping flash gameplay where you gotta collect the 4 jet pods and then exit the stage at the designated zone. There's some decent variety here, but the gameplay experience will still feel very familiar to Jumping Flash veterans, just now cut up into smaller bite-sized chunks. As a result, the maps in this game tend to be a lot smaller than what you would see in previous entries. While Jumping Flash's levels wouldn't take very long to complete if you know where to go, missions in this game can take anywhere from 60 seconds to 5 minutes depending on the challenge itself, and most maps are designed to cater to these shorter segments. And while I do like the level design on offer here, there's no denying the smaller maps definitely feel a bit lacking compared to the larger playgrounds that I'm more used to from the previous games. Plus, it's also a little disappointing that these maps tend to be revisited multiple times for different missions, so not only are they small, you'll be seeing a few of them quite often too. Although for collectors, you can find these cards hidden around different maps, and money you earn from missions can also be spent to purchase booster packs for more cards. What these cards do? Not much really, but you can select them to see a very short video of everyday objects in 3D. So that's nice. Beyond all of that though, the most important thing is that the core Jumping Flash gameplay remains as fun as ever, with both action and platforming continuing to be the game's biggest strength. Control is more or less unchanged, with your new yellow Robbit maintaining the series' iconic triple jump functionality. Tap the X button once for a short jump, tap it again to jump even higher and point your camera towards the earth, and then finally jump once again to get that final extra bit of height. This system here works so well, not just for shooting and jumping on enemies, which not only looks cool but is really fun, but platforming in this game is a breeze solely down to this little shadow that appears below your character while you're in the air. If anything, the platforming here is more precise than many of the 3D platformers on the console. This is why I said the game is kind of easy, but regardless of difficulty, I just find the platforming so responsive and satisfying to do. I just never get tired of it. Besides the platforming, the game also has FPS elements too, with all of your main attacks being projectiles. You've got an infinite standard shot and can also hold one special weapon as well, either a bomb, some rockets, or this OP laser, which for obvious reasons I always use. Although annoyingly, this game does only let you hold one item compared to the previous game's 3. Also, you can free aim using the R1 button if you like, which does come in quite handy. And new to this game, you can now slam down on enemies by pressing the triangle button while you're up in the air. I didn't actually use this feature too much for killing enemies, but I did find it invaluable for jump cancelling, allowing me to move much quicker through levels and saving me during some of the trickier time segments. So yeah, in a nutshell, this is classic Jumping Flash, just smaller and more bite-sized. It's a concept I quite like, but I'd be lying if I said that I didn't miss the bigger maps and worlds of the older games. The gameplay is still great, no doubt about it, but for a non-Japanese speaker, you're looking at maybe 2 minutes of gameplay and then 4 minutes of dialogue versus a normal 5-minute level with no interruptions. And well, if you look at it that way, you might see where this game can fall short. There is of course nothing wrong with the inclusion of these parts. The game definitely feels like a more lighthearted and comedic take full of individual stories and fun characters, but they take up about half the game's runtime. With these included, I actually think this is the longest game in the series, but if you skip all of these, you'll actually end up with the shortest game with the weakest level design in the series. And once you beat 30 of the game's missions in any order, you just go right into the end section and that's about it. That's not to say there aren't some definite highlights in this game. Some of the missions are the most challenging that I've played in the series, the callbacks to older games are always great to see, the boss fights feel like proper Jumping Flash boss fights, the last boss in particular being quite the challenge, I gotta say. But if you take away all of this game's dialogue and plot, what we have here is easily the weakest jumping flash game from a gameplay perspective, I am unfortunately sad to say. The presentation is also an interesting topic as well, because this game has the benefit of coming out 3 years after the last entry in the series, which usually would mean it would see some significant upgrades on the visual front, and in many ways the game does deliver, with some great looking cutscenes, a charming world map, nice visual upgrades to your Robbit's cockpit, and some improved texture work, giving the game a much cleaner look overall. That being said though, I think this entry also lost a little of the charm from the older games. The environments and colours just seem more muted in this entry, and I think this goes hand in hand with the levels themselves being a little less fantastical here too. I always associate Jumping Flash with large, bright, colourful locations, and this entry, while more technically impressive, doesn't really match up to the vibe of the older games, at least in my opinion. Performance is also a bit all over the place too. The game seems to have an uncapped frame rate, so your gameplay can go anywhere from 60 FPS to 15 FPS depending on the situation. Most of the time the game does seem to float somewhere in the 30s and the 40s, which is pretty good, but I'm not going to say it's the smoothest experience out there, but most of the time it does run really well. Music is another interesting one as well. I actually think this game has some really catchy tunes covering a very eclectic mix of genres. A lot of the music is quite strange, lighthearted and whimsical, matching the tone of the game really well, like the world map music, which just has a cat meowing as an instrument. My only real issue with the music is that many of the game's tracks are very short loops lasting only about 60 to 90 seconds on average. I guess it's just because the levels are generally quite short, but the tracks always just seem to finish as they're about to get good, which is a shame because there actually is some really great stuff here. So that's Robbit Mon Dieu, a different yet familiar take on the Jumping Flash formula that unfortunately doesn't meet the highs of the other entries in the series. That's not to say that it's a bad game. I actually enjoyed playing through this one from start to finish, but it's clear a big part of this game is its emphasis on story and dialogue, and if you can't experience that, what you're left with is a Jumping Flash game made up of brief missions, a small selection of maps, and a few boss fights, and it's telling that the game's clear highlights are the parts where it pays homage to the originals, so I think that says it all really. I'd still happily recommend Robbit Mon Dieu, but only to existing Jumping Flash fans. I think this will definitely scratch the itch if you're looking for something new in the series. Everybody else though, if you like the look of this game, just play the originals first. They are still some of the most underrated platformers on the console in my opinion, and if you dig them, then no doubt you'll probably dig this one too. Or just try Geograph Seal. That game does look pretty great, I'm not gonna lie.
You will provide.
Our final game and viewer selection for Volume 8 is Bunmei Korokoro Game Egg, which made its way to the PlayStation in February of 1998. You can also just call it Egg! This game was added to the wheel by JPN OST. I think I have a cousin with that name. This game was developed by a studio called Beyond Interactive, and while there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of info available online about their work during the 90s, these guys are still active in Japan, having been brought in to support development for games like El Shaddai, Devil's Third, and most recently Samurai Jack Battle Through Time. When you leave them to make a game on their own though, well, what you get is an egg-centric turn-based strategy, golf game. That's also a city builder. It's certainly a unique concept, but how does all this egg rolling work, and more importantly, is it any fun? Well, let's find out. Now when you boot up Egg, you'll have access to two different options, a single player mission mode and a versus mode that you can play with up to 4 people or even 4 AI if you like. This mission mode represents the main single player content and also kinda acts as the game's tutorial. Now when I say tutorial, the game doesn't have one in the traditional sense, and if you go into this game blind from the get-go, no doubt you might be feeling a little bit confused about what's acting out in front of you. Luckily though, if you hang out on the main menu for a little while, a short tutorial video will play explaining some of the game's basic concepts. Now while the visual aids here are useful, you'll probably want to pick up on the text appearing on screen too, so Google Lens once again comes in very handy here. So the core idea is that you're in a battle against an enemy egg, and you can win in one of 2 different ways, either destroying the enemy egg, or build a city so advanced that you simply transcend into the cosmic abyss and just win. This may all seem kinda confusing, but surprisingly the gameplay here isn't all that complicated once you know what you're doing. As mentioned, this is a turn-based game where you and opponents take turns rolling around the map by using a simple golf-style shooting mechanic where you pick a direction and power level and then shoot your egg off to create some life. As you can see, as the egg rolls across neutral territory, it will leave newly constructed buildings in its wake. This here is really the core gimmick of the game. The egg builds cities, and by building larger connected cities, you gain more ways to both defend yourself and attack your enemy's egg, all while in the process they're trying to do the same thing to you. Now while these cities can get pretty big and complex, all of the legwork here is actually done automatically. These cities are completely self-sufficient and upgrade automatically over time depending on the size of your city and the proximity of your egg to its location. What starts out as a pretty modest cityscape can soon turn into a complicated and well-fortified city with tons of unique areas and buildings. It's actually really fun seeing these things come together, and the style of city built differs depending on the color of the egg selected. These are purely cosmetic, but there's 8 different types included in the game, and there is some great variety on show, especially when it comes to the weird eggs. Now the key to creating a city isn't just to roll all over the place and cover as much distance as possible. The secret is to actually try create connecting tiles in a circular formation to close in gaps on the map. If you connect all the tiles around a certain area, that area will then automatically get turned into a city space on the map, allowing you to take huge portions of land with very little effort. So what did these cities actually do, you might ask? Well, not a whole lot really. As mentioned, you don't have any direct control over your buildings. Instead, they mostly serve as a power source to generate energy for your special attacks, as well as a blockade that damages enemies and even heals your egg. You see, if an enemy rolls over some of your spaces, depending on the level of the buildings, the enemy egg can actually delete your land, which is no good. Of course, you can do the same to them, but if you like, you can also activate some special attacks with the energy generated from your cities. You have access to tsunamis and bombs if you want to straight up delete away parts of the map. You can roll around and create an earthquake to cause some hassle, or most annoyingly of all, you can reinforce your land with barriers, making it much more difficult for enemy eggs to get over to your position. Well, without bombs that is. All that's really left to discuss are the actual methods of victory, because you've got a few different options available to scramble some eggs. The first and probably most straightforward way is to ignore everything else in the game and just shoot yourself at the enemy egg. Each egg has a health bar, and if you can destroy the enemy egg, well, you just outright win. This is why barriers and strong buildings can be quite the hassle, because they can very easily damage your egg, making for very precarious back and forths. The second way to win is by destroying your opponent's tower. Oh yeah, so this is your tower, more or less the heart of your civilization. You see, when you make your first loop on a map, a tower will spawn in the center, and if you can destroy your opponent's tower, this will make their egg shatter and you also just win the game. And the final way to win is the defensive tactic, leveling up your tower to max rank. As your city grows and evolves, the tower in the center becomes more powerful, and when you reach the final power level of 9, you transcend and also just win the game. And yeah, that's about all there is to Egg, and as weird as it may seem, it's actually not the most complicated game in the world. There's a lot going on, sure, but really at the end of the day, you're just playing golf with an egg and creating civilizations, you know? Now, about the mission mode, this is a series of 1v1 battles that aim to teach you the core fundamentals of the game. Each mission aims to highlight things like movement and the various ways that you can win. For example, the first mission, your goal is to cover 30% of the map before your opponent does. The next is to win by crashing into the egg. The one after that is to win by destroying its city, and then after that by getting a max level tower. Now at first I thought this was going to be a fun series of scenarios, each with a brand new strict objective needed to win, but once you make it past the first 4 missions, the game then just becomes a series of 1v1 fights where you just try to win using any method you like. Only the missions start throwing in big obstacles, namely tons of enemy barriers that they can pass through and you can't. Also, they damage your egg. Yeah, it's kind of hard. Now, while these missions are very challenging, they're also kind of fun. The problem though is that there's only 3 of them after the initial 4 tutorial ones, and then the game just kind of ends. Although you will earn one of the strangest cutscenes you'll ever see, so that's something. So yeah, mission mode, really just an advanced tutorial for the meat of the game. Versus mode. Now truthfully, this game is very much geared towards multiplayer gameplay. Don't forget, you can play this one with up to 4 players, and as you can imagine, it becomes much more hectic when played like this, but I'd be still lying if I said it wasn't pretty fun. You can choose from any of the 8 different eggs, there's 8 different map styles to select from. If you somehow find 3 other friends who really wanted to get hooked on a game called Egg, well, you could certainly waste away the hours here, although for those playing this solo, content-wise, there's really not a lot here beyond AI battles when all is said and done. And I suppose as for the presentation, I don't know, there's just something oddly captivating about this game. Like, it's certainly not the most technically impressive game for 1998, but something about its city designs, the weird buildings and devices that show up, the fact there are ominous giant eggs rolling about, whatever the hell is going on during the game's cutscenes, the game's font choices, the game's end screens, it's just mad. Also, Egg is kind of spooky in a way too, which mostly comes down to the game's strange music and audio. Now the game actually has some bops in here. The music often features some traditional music flavors, which I think goes along nicely with the city building gameplay. But some of the music is also very, very strange, and dare I say a little ominous at times too, like the music that plays when you lose, straight out of a survival horror game. And the music on the Black Egg stage, it sounds like an industrial nightmare. I still kind of love it though. So that's Egg, a deceptively simple turn-based strategy game that is also absolutely insane. Truthfully, this game would have been very confusing to play if I didn't try to pick up on some of the tips using Google Lens, because I mean, what's even going on here really, you know? It's not like anybody is making an online guide for this thing. But once it all clicked, I actually quite liked it. It can certainly be a little frustrating and difficult, the wait times between turns can drag on a little, and the content is very low if you don't plan on playing it with friends, but as a unique concept that's really out there trying something different that actually kind of managed to succeed, well, I can't help but admire it, you know? So I guess that puts Egg as my current top Egg game on the PS1 for now. We still gotta try Cyber Egg and Eggs of Steel, but regardless of how those games turn out, I doubt any game is gonna out-weird this Egg for a little while yet. So there you go, that was volume number 8. Certainly quite the selection the wheel provided for us today, and further proof that half this console's library was actually developed by insane people. We got to check out a Virtual-On clone that actually offers up a decent alternative for PlayStation owners, especially if you own that big ass controller. A psychic murder mystery that also has janky beat 'em up sections to fool dumb people like me into playing them. A Japan-only follow-up to a much-loved PlayStation franchise that I'm not actually surprised didn't leave Japan. And finally Egg, a completely normal game with nothing weird going on at all. As always, we need to slot each game into one of 5 categories. Is the game a must play? Is it something worth trying if you like the look of it? Is the game just kinda meh? Is the game trash and not worth your time? Or did I find the game unplayable due to the language barrier? Our ratings for Volume 8 see Project Gaiaray, Robbit Mon Dieu and Egg making it into Tri-tier, with Psychometrer Eiji unsurprisingly becoming game number 2 to enter into no Gaijin territory. Yes, Project Gaiaray wears its influence on its sleeve, a little more brazenly than most fighting games, but if I'm taking every game I play at face value, which I do by the way, then this game is a really fun twin-stick robot fighter on the PlayStation. Its mechanics are sound, the music is great, the controls are quick and responsive, and when the action is at its best, the game can be an absolute blast to play. While it's certainly not the pinnacle of the genre gameplay or tech-wise, if you like Virtual-On but don't have a Saturn, then you really can't go wrong with this one. When it comes to Robbit Mon Dieu, let me be upfront, this is a very fun game, but it is also, without a doubt, the weakest jumping flash game. With the game's much bigger focus on cutscenes and dialogue, there's a lot a non-Japanese speaker is going to miss out on when playing this, about half of the game actually. And even if you can speak the language, the shorter mission-based gameplay does feel a little bit lacking when compared to the series' previous entries. That being said, if you're a fan of jumping flash, the game is still absolutely recommended, but for newcomers, do not try this one until you've played the originals first, and you should play the originals, they're like an hour long. Come on. Now I gotta say, almost all of the viewer games I played on this channel so far have been pretty odd, but this one definitely takes the cake, or egg, I guess. What may seem nonsensical to the naked eye actually turns out to be a pretty straightforward turn-based strategy game, one that I actually had a fun time playing. Yes, it's very low on content for single players, and it might be a bit of a challenge to ever convince somebody to play it with you, but if you can get 3 people to sit down and learn the rules, you're in for one of the oddest party games ever created, and frankly, one that I think a lot of people will actually enjoy, even if the music will haunt your dreams. And finally, Psychometrer Eiji, a prime example of why 10 seconds of gameplay doesn't really tell the full story and why that sometimes may not work out in my favour. And look, while I can't speak on the actual quality of this game since I'm missing out on its main selling point, this does seem like a fun video game adaptation of the series with some cool ideas, nice graphics and some bonus animated cutscenes, which will surely pop fans of the source material. And I got further than I thought I could, so there you go, could have been worse. Now before we finish up, I have to give a special thanks to Jivif Hedbuf for your submission to the viewer wheel, a confusing game from the person with a confusing name. Definitely on brand, you love to see it. If you'd like to submit your choice for a game to appear in future volumes of the series, you can check out the channel update video. You'll see a link for it in the description below. Also, some cool news for those unaware. Community Palm, a game featured in volume 7 of this series and winner of the coveted must play rating, recently received a full fan translation, courtesy of the Memco translation. So those of you who are interested in checking it out, there has quite literally never been a better time to do so. So get right on it. Well, I think that about does it for today's episode. As always, a big thank you to everybody tuning in, whether you're new to the series or a long-time viewer. Just know I appreciate you. Like, comment and subscribe if you haven't already, and if not, don't even worry about it. Don't let me tell you what to do. I could be a giant egg for all you know, and you know what? You should never trust an egg. I'll be back as quick as I can with another video where I try to get you to spend 50+ minutes watching me talk about games nobody cares about. See you soon, and don't forget to praise the wheel.